Right, this is the video for chapter 9 of the Applied Management Unit, which is on activity-based costing. So activity-based costing is covered at level 3, so hopefully it should be familiar to you, but it is an area that people often find challenging at level 3 and perhaps don't worry about too much because it never seemed to come up in the exam very much. But we do need to understand it now fully because it is pretty likely to appear in this one. So I am going to share the course book with you. And as we go through along, I will also be sharing with you the 2 examples that I handed out to you in hard copy in the lesson last Friday in readiness for this. Right, so a few points to note first of all. So we're dealing with activity-based costing. So we need to be clear that activity-based costing is basically a more sophisticated version of absorption costing. So absorption costing absorbs all overheads using the same overhead absorption rate. So what I mean by that is with absorption costing, you lump in all of your overheads for that particular production department, and then you divide it either by the number of units, the number of labour hours, or the number of machine hours, and then you absorb those overheads into the product or all on that same basis. But for some businesses, that's not going to be very accurate because the overheads aren't really kind of directly linked to the number of labour hours or the number of machine hours that it takes to make the product. So enter activity-based costing, which is a more sophisticated way to absorb overheads based on what has caused them to occur in the first place. Which brings us on neatly to some key terminology. Leave that there for a second. Around this idea of the cost pools and the cost drivers. Right, so you can see here an explanation of what this is. So overheads are grouped into activities, which are the cost pools. So let me try and give an example of that. So a cost pool might be the costs involved in setting up production runs. So maybe someone has to come and set the machine at particular, I'm not very good at manufacturing, as you can probably tell, but has to set the machine on certain settings. Maybe someone has to come and check that the machine is operating as it should. Maybe a test run has to be done to check for quality. So the costs of all these activities to do with setting up a production run would be your cost pool. So this would be an example of a cost pool. What drives that cost would be the number of times that a new production run has to be set up. So the cost driver would be that, the number of times a new production run is set up. So a reminder, this is the cost pool, an example, and this would be the cost driver. So just to give sort of one more example, so a cost pool might be having to maintain machines. So that could be the cost of spare parts, it could be the cost of the people actually doing the maintenance, it could be the regular inspections to see if they need maintenance. And we could argue that that cost is driven by how much the machines are used. So maybe it's driven by the number of machine hours. So with that example, we are using machine hours because that is driving the machine maintenance cost. But with this other example, it's nothing to do with the number of machine hours. It's every time a new production run is set up, then that is what's driving the costs. Another example might be placing orders for purchases. So I could say the cost pool would be the costs of placing purchase orders. So that might be, you know, the person that has to actually sit there and sort of place the order, whether that's by telephone or online, whatever it may be. There's still going to be time to do that. Maybe having to seek authorization. To a point, you might say, well, there's an element of the phone bill, or there's an element of the internet charge involved in placing those purchase orders. When the order actually arrives, there's a cost involved of checking that what's arrived is actually what was ordered. There's a cost involved with checking that what they say on the delivery note is exactly what has been received. There's a cost involved of when the invoice arrives, matching it against what was ordered and what was received, and actually authorising the payment. So there's a lot of costs that could be put into that cost pool. And again, that would be driven by the number of times orders are placed. So if you do remember at level 3, when we talked about economic order quantities, there's always a balance between keeping on placing orders and holding the stock for too long. So there are costs involved with repeatedly placing orders. So hopefully that's given you an idea of what we mean by a cost pool and a cost driver. So you can then see sort of up above here, it's talking about calculating a cost per unit by taking the cost pool, dividing it by the cost driver to get a specific overhead absorption rate just for that particular cost pool and cost driver. So for that reason, using activity-based costing is generally held to be time-consuming and costly because you've got to kind of figure all this out for all the different cost pools and cost drivers. And at some point, you just might not be able to do it. You might just still have to say, well, look, I've got this overhead. You know, it's just too confusing. It's taking too long to sort of work it all out like this. So there might still be some arbitrary, which means, you know, it's not particularly driven by, you know, like in my examples, it might be that there's an overhead and you just go, oh, do you know what, I will just share that out by the number of units because it's the easiest thing to do. So that's what that criticism is all about. But generally, if you can put activity-based costing in place, it does lead to more accurate analysis of your profitability, better pricing decisions, and better cost control. Right? And through the examples that we've got, hopefully we'll sort of see that in action. So I'm now going to switch to the, God, can you hear that bird? It's really loud. My spring must be here. I'm now going to switch to activity number 9, which was taken from a level 3 book, because I think it's quite a nice example. As I said, I gave you this in hard copy, but I will link it to this video as well in case you've misplaced it. So having attended an AAT course on activity-based costing, you decide to experiment by applying the principles to the 4 products currently made and sold by your company. So very originally named P1, P2, P3, P4. So we've got varying output levels. We've got varying direct material costs, direct labour costs. And if we scroll down to the next page, we've got these various overhead costs. And they've been analysed into different cost pools. So setup costs, stores receiving costs, inspection and quality control costs, and materials handling and dispatch costs. And then we have been given that for each of these 4 cost pools, this is what is driving those costs. So setting up the number of production runs, that's the same example I used. Stores receiving is driven by the number of requisitions raised. A requisition is just a request for stock into your store. Inspection and quality control, the number of production runs as well, because every time a production run takes place, then you're going to have these costs involved as well. Orders executed will be driving your materials handling and dispatches. It then goes on to tell us the number of production runs, which obviously features twice, the number of requisitions raised, and the number of orders executed. And conveniently, in this particular example, it has calculated the totals for us. You don't often see that, so take it while you can. Fill in the table below to calculate the cost per driver for each overhead cost. Now, I did say this is a level 3 example, so, it has spelled it out to us quite nicely, but that's good for the first example that we're going to look at. So I'm not going to keep flicking up and down. I know that you've got this with you. So setup costs was 5,250. And we're going to divide that by the number of production runs. So the total number of production runs I just highlighted above was 21. So that gives us a cost per production run of £250. Then we do the same for the others. So stores receiving, we've got a total of 3,600. It happens, there's 80 requisitions raised, which is the driving force. So that gives us £45. Same process for the other 2. Right, so just taking the overhead and dividing it by the total number of times that the cost driver occurs. Using your answers from A, calculate the overhead costs for each product. Right, so number of production runs, 6,546. So the cost per production run. So cost per production run is simply going to be, didn't need to do any calculation. It's the £250 that I've just calculated. So the cost per production run, this is a little bit pointless. So it's going to be 250 across all of these. So the setup costs per product is just going to be these multiplied together. So 6 production runs, £250 for each one, gives me a total of £1,500 for product 1. Same approach, 5 times 250, 4 times 250, and 6 times 250. So that's our setup costs per product. So we could just double check. So add those all together. And I get my total of 5,250. Very similar to when we used to do apportioning. Right, so just sharing out the cost as fairly as possible, basically. So then we come to the next block. So cost per requisition raised. So you're just getting that 45 from your answer to part A. So a little bit unnecessary, that row. But as I said, this is a level 3 one, so it's just feeding us every single bit. And then just multiply it. So 20 times 45. Same again. Same again. This one's boring. And same again. Right, number of production runs. So this is on production runs again. So cost per production run for the inspection and quality. So I'm just looking back to my answer to part A was £100. So I'm going to put that 100 in across all of those. And then inspection quality control cost per product. So that's just multiplying it. And then finally, exactly the same principle for last. Okay. So then we come to part C, fill in the table below to calculate the total costs for each product. So direct material, put it right back to the beginning. So we've got £40 of cost per unit for direct material, and we've got 120 items of P1. So this is just going to be 40 times that 120, which is 4,800. For P2, you can look back at the original table, so that'll be 50 times 100. For P3, it's going to be 80 times 30. And for P4, it's going to be 120 times 60. Same approach for direct labour. So for P1, it's 120 times 28. I'm looking back right at the first page to get that information. 100 times 21. 80 times 14. And then 120 units times 21. And now we are working out our overheads using activity-based costing. So our setup costs, so I'm looking back at my answer to part B. My setup cost for P1 was 1,500. For P2 was 1,250. Right, so I'm just copying in those overheads that I've worked out in part B using activity-based costing. Right, then we do the same for the stores, so they were all 900. The same for inspection and quality, so we've got 600, 500, 400, 600, and the same for material handling and dispatch. So we've got 1320, just copying these in for my answers to part B. So then I work out my total cost by adding my direct material, my direct labour, and then all these components of the overheads. And then to work out a unit cost for each one, you just divide it by the number of units. So for P1, there was 120 units. So 12480 divided by 120 gives me £104 per unit. Again, just add everything up for P2. Divide it by 100 units. Same for P3. Divide it by our 80 units. And finally for P4, divide it by our 120 units. Okay, so on completion of all of that, we now have some pretty accurate unit costs. Whereas if we had done that using just traditional absorption costing, each unit cost would not have been so accurate, and therefore our pricing might not have been so accurate. Okay, so that's the first example. Moving on then to the Kaplan example that I gave you, JKL Limited. So JKL Limited manufactures two products, the MNO and the PQR. It takes 4 hours of labour to make an MNO and 8 hours of labour to make a PQR. Right, so at this point, I'm just going to work out how many labour hours I need altogether. So if I got some information, let's just have a little look. Yeah, so can you see here, I've got my budgeted production units. That wasn't very straight, was it? 2,000 for MNO and 4,000 for PQR. So I'm just going to work out my total labour hours. So 4 for MNO, and I've got to make 2,000 of those. And then I'm going to add that to my 8 hours for each of 4,000 PQRs. So altogether, I know that I am budgeting for 40,000 labour hours. We'll see why I've done that in a moment. The overhead activities for these machine setups and special parts handling have budgets of 160,000, so that's for machine setups, and 80,000, so that's for special parts handling. So overall, that gives me a total budgeted overhead of 160 plus 80, which is £240,000. Other information about the MNO and PQR is below. So as before, we've got our material costs, our direct labour costs, and then we've got some information here that's going to help us for our activity-based costing. So unlike in the previous example, it hasn't told us the total. So I'm just going to add in a total column here and see that I need 400 special parts altogether. And I'm going to have 250 plus 150. Oh, that's annoying. That's 400 as well. So we're never going to know which 400 we're referring to, but never mind. So our total number of special parts, 400. Our total number of machine setups, also 400. Right. So what else do we need to work out? Don't know yet, so let's move on down. So it says calculate the fixed overheads assuming they are absorbed on a budgeted labour hour basis. So this part of the question is using traditional absorption costing. So to work out how much fixed overhead is going into each product, using traditional absorption costing, we first have to work out our overhead absorption rate. Using traditional methods, that's going to be the total budgeted overhead, which was 240,000, divided by the total budgeted labour hours, which we calculated here as 40,000. So our OAR is going to be 240,000 divided by 40,000, which gives us £6 per labour hour. So to work out my fixed overhead for the MNO, I need to know how many labour hours is the MNO using. So kind of work that out right up here, right? Because for the MNO, we said it was 4 hours to make 2,000 products. So that's 8,000 hours for the MNO. So let's times our overhead absorption rate by those 8,000 hours, which gives me 48,000. For the PQR, it's going to be that same overhead absorption rate, £6. And then we need to know how many hours for the PQR. So we did that here. 8 times 4, 8 times 4,000 is 32,000. So 6 times my 32,000 hours for the PQR gives me a figure of 192,000. And then you can check, does it add up? So if you do 192 plus the 48, it does indeed take you back to your total £240,000 of overhead that you basically dished out between the two products. So that's the traditional method. In part B, we're asked to do the same, but using activity-based costing. So it starts the cost driver rate for special parts handling. So special parts handling. So we know there's 400 altogether. We worked out here. And we know that the special parts handling, that was the £80,000, the second one. So I'm going to do £80,000 divided by 400 to work out my overhead absorption rate specific for this cost pool and cost driver. So £80,000 divided by 400 number of times gives me £200 per, what was it? What was the actual phrase we used? Per special parts handling, the number of special parts. For the machine setups, so let's get the figures for that. So we are looking at this £160,000. And we know that that happened 400 times as well. So this time I'm going to do, I'll write it here, 160,000 divided by the 400 times it happens, which gives me £400 per machine setup. So then for product MNO, what's the total amount of special parts overhead that we are going to put in for the MNO? So we've just worked out that it's £200 every time it happens. And if we look back at our table, we can see that for the MNO, it happens 350 times. So what I'm going to do in here is calculate my £200 per time, and I know that it happened 350 times. So that gives me a total of £70,000. For the PQR, won't go up again, but because you know where the figures are coming from now, hopefully. So it's £200 each time it happens. That's this 200. This happened 50 times, so 200 times 50 gives me 10,000. Then we repeat for the machine setups. So for the MNO, we know that each one's costing £400. I can see here that it happens 250 times. So I am going to do the calculation of this £400 here. £400 each time it happens. It's happening 250 times. So that gives me a figure of £100,000. And then for the PQR, it's the same £400 every time it happens, times 150 times, which I've got from here, which gives me a figure of £60,000. So the total overhead then for the MNO, it hasn't asked me for this, but I'm going to work it out because I'm going to need it in a minute, is 170,000. And for the PQR is 160,000. Again, if we add those together, 170 plus 160. Oh no, sorry, that's not what have I done there. Oh, that's not 100. Sorry, that. So lucky I checked. That should be 70,000. It's 10 plus 60. I do apologise. So 170 plus 70 takes me back once more to my total of £240,000 of total overhead that I'm trying to dish out as fairly as possible. So we can see with the absorption costing, the 240 was split 48, 192. And now with activity-based costing, total different split, 170 plays 70. So you can probably start to think about the difference this is going to cause when we do part C, which says, using the information from A and B, calculate the total cost per unit using traditional absorption costing as compares to the new activity-based costing. Right, so regardless of which one we are using, we know that the materials cost £16, just reading that straight off the information at the beginning of this activity. £16 for the MNO, £24 for the PQR. Labour. Again, it doesn't make any difference how you absorb your overhead. So this is £20 for the PQR and £40 for, sorry, £20 for the MNO, £40 for the PQR. So we have got a prime cost of £36 for the MNO and £64 for the PQR. So if I assume, first of all, that my overheads have been absorbed using absorption costing methods, and we look back to our answer in part A, so we had £48,000 for the MNO. That's my answer to part A. And I know that that relates to 2,000 units of production. So 48,000 divided by 2,000 gives me per unit £24 of overhead using traditional absorption costing for the MNO. For the PQR, the calculation is going to be, so part A, I had £192,000 and that was for 4,000 units of production. So 192 divided by 4,000 gives me £48. So my absorption cost, 36 plus 24 gives me 60. 64 plus 48 gives me £112. Right, so that is my answer using traditional absorption costing. If I now switch to using activity-based costing, let's just backtrack and get rid of this. Right, so we're now going to use activity-based costing and replace the calculations that we just did with the information from part B. So it's no longer 48,000 divided by 2,000 units. Using activity-based costing, I worked out, didn't I, £170,000, this figure here. So I'm going to do 170,000 divided by 2,000 units, which gives me £85 now for the overhead for the MNO. And the total overhead that went into the PQR using activity-based costing was 70,000. So 70,000 divided by 4,000 gives me £17.50. So now my absorption cost, but using activity-based costing principles, so for the MNO is 36 plus 85, which is £121, compared now to 64 plus £17.50, which is £81.50. So you can see that changing the way we've absorbed the overheads for this quite overhead heavy business would totally have changed our decision making. We thought it was costing £60 to make an MNO and £112 to make a PQR, but actually the costing, when we've done it more accurately, has switched around. So think about, like, when you're doing your pricing, you might have thought, oh, it's costing me £60, I'll charge £80, happy days. But actually that £80 wouldn't even have been properly covering the overheads. It might turn out that there's no way that people are going to buy the MNO for, I don't know, what, 150 that you would need to make a profit on this. So your decision might be, well, it's not worth us making the MNO. We need to focus more on the PQR. So hopefully that's demonstrated clearly to you the difference that it makes by doing it more accurately. So if I just go back to the book now. Bear with me a second, I've lost my piece of paper. Here it is. And let's have a look at activity number 1. Illustration. There is an illustration there in the book that you can have a look at yourself. I'm not going to talk through that because it's obviously very similar to the ones that I've just done. So you then have activity number 1. Let me find it. here we are, Roasted Limited on page 198. Right, so again, I'm going to go through this, but you don't have to watch if you've got the gist of it, but just for in case some people need a bit more help still. So Roasted Limited, a medium-sized coffee manufacturing company, produces two products, ground coffee and coffee beans. The company has invested in new integrated technologies throughout all sections of the business, from the use of robotics in the production line through to reporting software in the accounting function. A traditional absorption costing method is currently used, and it has been suggested that activity-based costing may be more appropriate following the introduction of improved technologies throughout the company. The following information regarding the company has been provided. Right, so again, we can see a number of inspections. So these are going to be cost drivers. So as before, let's just make a note of the total. IT support in hours, another cost driver. So make a note of the total. You're going to need that. Also worth just figuring out the total hours. So what have we got here? So ground coffee, direct materials per unit, direct labour hours per unit at £10 per hour. Right, so we're saying 4 thinking what that's saying. So 4 hours per unit. So I think that means the actual number of hours. So it's going to cost us £40. Just jot that down. And then we've got 6 hours here. So that's presumably going to cost us £60. The total hours. So if it's 4 hours to make, and we want 40,000 units. So 4 times 40,000. We're going to need 160,000 hours there altogether. And then 6 hours times 30,000 units. So that would be 180,000 hours, giving us a total number of hours of 180 plus 160 is 340,000. Right, so that's our total hours. Just a little bit of prep there. Budgeted costs for the 2 overhead activities. So total there is going to be 11360. We just worked out that we have a total of 340,000 hours, so we could just work out the overhead absorption rate there, done on a direct labour hour basis. So that's going to come to £4 per labour hour. Calculate the direct costs and production overheads per unit for ground coffee and coffee beans using the traditional. So this is very similar to that example I just showed you. So direct costs are going to be, right, where are we getting that from? So we've got, so we've got £10 direct materials, we've got £40 of direct labour, so we're just adding those two together for the direct costs. So that gives me £50 and 71. The production overheads, doing it on the traditional absorption cost method, we know it's £4 per hour. So 4 hours, 4 times 4, that will give me 16. And here £4 per hour, and there were 6 hours, so 4 times 6 gives me 24. And then I just add together to get my total costs using the traditional method. Straightforward. And then using activity-based costing, so our direct costs are the same as before. This says to 2 decimal places, sorry. So 50.00, 71.00. Right, and then we come on to our activity-based costing. So inspections, I can see that we had £400,000, and we calculated that there are 800 inspections altogether. So that would give me the amount per inspection. And then I can just go straight on and multiply that by the number of inspections for each department. So times it by 680 for the ground coffee. Oh, but we want it per unit, don't we? So I'm going to have to do, let's slow down a bit. So 400,000 divided by 800 gives me 500 per inspection. There's 680 inspections in the ground coffee, so that gives me 340,000. But then I need to divide that by the number of sales that I'm producing. So that's the 40,000. So 340 divided by 40,000. So that gives me £8.50 for the ground coffee. And then for the coffee beans, I'll do exactly the same sum as I just did there, except instead of timesing by 680, I will be timesing by 120. So let's rework that. So that comes to 60,000. 60,000 divided by 30,000 this time, because that's the number of products. So that clearly gives me a figure of £2. IT support. So hopefully what you're seeing here is, although the concept's the same, the way the question's presented is slightly different in the 3 examples that I've done with you here. Hopefully by sort of understanding the concept that you're basically apportioning the total cost for each thing, then just keep mind of what you're trying to achieve. Don't have to sort of memorize a method, and then you should be able to kind of figure things out. So for IT support, we are saying that we've got a total of £960,000, which relates to a total of 24,000 support hours, which was the cost driver. And then for the ground coffee, we will times that by the 20,000 hours. So that gives me a total of, so 960,000 divided by 24,000 times by 20,000. So that gives me 800,000, which I'm going to divide by the number of units, which was 40,000. So that gives me a cost per unit for the ground coffee of £20. For the coffee beans, I won't type it in this time, but we're going to do the 960,000 divide by the 24,000, that's the total. This time times it by 4,000, which gives us 160,000, which needs to be divided by the 30,000 units, which gives me a figure of £5.33 for each unit. We then add up our total costs. And as in our previous example, you can see that we get quite different figures between the absorption costing in part A and the activity-based costing in part B. So part C asks us to discuss the differences between the product cost calculated using the traditional method and the activity-based costing method. So I would probably split my answer just by sort of talking about absorption costing first. So just describing what's happened. So we can see with the absorption costing, the product costs were higher for coffee beans than for ground coffee. The absorption costing assumes all overheads are driven by labour hours, which is unrealistic. Whereas with the activity-based costing, we might say the product costs are more consistent. Could throw some numbers in here as well, really, but you can see 78.50, 78.33. Could have made a distinction between the fact that under activity-based costing, it looks like the ground coffee is the more cheap one to produce, whereas using activity-based costing, it actually tips over to the, I know it's still the same, but the difference is much, much tighter. You could make that sort of comment as well, that's fine. So product costs are more consistent. Cost drivers are more appropriate due to the increased use of robotics in production. Okay, so again, feel free to review their answer in full, but just basically describing what differences have arisen between the two methods. And then explain the benefits that the activity-based costing system may have over traditional absorption costing system. So these are kind of must-learn points in preparation for the written parts in this exam. So you will find the advantages and disadvantages spelled out in the textbook. It is worth basically putting those onto some kind of revision card and being able to reel out a few advantages and disadvantages. So you could say it's more sophisticated as it doesn't just assume all overheads absorbed on the same basis. You could say that it leads to overheads being apportioned between products more fairly, which in turn leads to more reliable business decisions, such as which products to concentrate on, and pricing strategies. And then final point that I think is worth making is that it is more relevant than traditional absorption costing as overheads become a greater proportion of the overall cost, right? Because traditionally you had a lot of labour cost and material cost, tiny bit of overhead. But now as overheads are becoming more significant, you do need that more sophisticated method of absorbing them. Right, so as I've said, it is important to be able to talk about the benefits of activity-based costing. So maybe practice writing something out that you can almost memorise, because I think it's a pretty, a pretty strong tip for the exam that you're going to have to be able to talk about that. And then explain how the use of technology can provide benefit to Roasted Limited's operational control processes. That's not really to do with activity-based costing too much. I mean, technology, maybe there's going to be some cost savings you could talk about, improved efficiencies. So you can start to see this exam, you know, just thinking about running the business. Could use to gather data for activity-based costing. Again, you would have to sort of elaborate on that a little bit more. Please do have a look at the suggested answer in the book, but that's the sort of thing that you should be coming up with, and not one to just sort of skip over. Okay, so that's activity number 1. So then, as I said, please do make sure that you have a read of these advantages and disadvantages. It does reiterate what I've said here, that a short written task in the assessment may ask you to explain advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, so I think it's quite likely to come up. So yes, there's a lot of detail there. I will just summarise that actually for you here. So the pros of activity-based costing are that you have improved decision making. So you've got reliable costing, can be used for your pricing strategy, can be used to decide focus of products, if you should discontinue any of them. It gives you improved cost control. So the reason for that is it becomes obvious what is driving costs. So you can decide, well, you know, how can we cut back here? How can we save money? Maybe we should be doing less production runs and doing bigger batches, for example. We've talked about improved pricing, and it also recognises complexity. So, for example, low volume products using more cost drivers, pushing up costs. So you need to be able to sort of talk about this in an exam situation. What's bad about them, well, the main thing is the time and cost involved to set it up in the first place. You could also mention that people are generally quite resistant to change, which can be a problem. And finally, it can be difficult to get all the required information or data. Hard to identify cost drivers, or maybe hard to actually match cost drivers with cost pools. It's best suited when you have got high production overheads relative to direct costs. So I've spoken about that already. Traditionally, you didn't have a high proportion of overheads. Now you have a much higher proportion, so it's worth investing time in this more sophisticated method of apportioning your overheads. Best suited also if you've got a diverse product range, because you need the specifics to make decisions around your different products. Right, so quite a lot covered there. I hope that's given you a much better understanding of activity-based costing. What you need to do, please, just to finish off for this chapter, is have a look at Test Your Learning number 2, which you will find on page 204. I mean, obviously the explain ones we've talked about in quite a lot of detail in this video, but please feel free to review their answers as well. And then, of course, have a look at the question bank tasks for chapter 9 on activity-based costing to give yourself some more practice.